Let's talk about some of our ground rules today. As you know, the chat is open. We're going to probably keep it open much of the time. There may be a few times when Cody's doing some stuff and it may be closed, but we're going to try to keep up with that as best we can today. So make sure you put your questions in the chat. There's 1.5 hours ACVREP credit, and our closed captioning is here. Thank you for that. Please feel free to take advantage of that if that will assist you. Presenting for us today, as has been the case in both part 1 and 2, Cody Laplante, who is a teacher of students with visual impairments, and he's also the creator of eye.t. You'll hear more about what eye.t is later on as well. Some challenges, maybe these are things that you found to be true for you. Screen reader instruction can at times be boring for students and for teachers. Students are resistant to learning screen readers for a variety of reasons. And there's a perception that there's not any really available curriculum or pathways to introduce screen readers to folks. And there can be a little variety in teaching lesson tasks, and that can really make people not interested in participating. Our learning objectives. So define the purpose. We're going to define the purpose of a practice activity. We're going to talk about 3 ways to incorporate fun into a practice activity. Identify 4 practice activities that you can incorporate into a screen reader lesson. And with that, let's turn it over to Cody and get this started.
All right. Thanks, Paul. It is great to be with everybody today. Again, for part 3 of 4, teaching screen readers the fun way. We are going to do a little bit of housekeeping and a little bit of kind of orientation, but we're not going to do too much of that today because this is one of the most fun of the 4 parts. And the reason is because today we're going to be talking about the practice activity. Now, in previous part 1 and part 2, if you haven't seen those, go back on YouTube, on the YouTube channel, and take a look at those. In those, we talked about the objective of a lesson, how to make that really set your lesson up for success. We talked about do nows, we talked about the instruction, and today we're talking about practice, okay? Now, why is this the most fun of the 4? Well, because I get to show you a lot of fun practice activities, and this is really where your screen reader lesson can shine in engagement, in getting everybody involved and making it really fun. So let's get started with this. I will say before we even move on to the first slide, I am always open to tangents. So if you have a question that you are dying to ask, please throw it in the chat because we can go off on a tangent and kind of come back as appropriate. Okay, so make sure that being part of this live session, there's the benefit of asking live questions. Take advantage of that. Okay, and I love asking or answering live questions. So we really want to go back to our overarching theme. What are we trying to accomplish in a screen reader lesson? Again, if you haven't attended parts 1 or 2, or even if you have, just a reminder that today we're going to be talking about not necessarily the key commands and the techniques to use a screen reader. All of that information is available in many, many, many places. And if you need help with that, we can certainly address it here. But the point of today's session and this whole series is to talk about how we deliver effective instruction on screen readers, okay? And that starts with, what are we trying to accomplish? When we sit down with our students and we say, we're going to teach you JAWS, or we're going to teach you NVDA, what are we trying to accomplish in that one lesson, all right? There's 6 things that we continue to talk about in this series. The first one is structure. We want to make sure that our lesson is structured, that when we sit down to teach screen readers, that it's going to be, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, which we talked about in parts 1 and 2, right? A lot of times we'll find that, and this is, you might find this in your own experience, but you sit down to do a JAWS lesson and you have, okay, so we're going to do this objective. And then all of a sudden, you know, there's this tangent, and then this happens, and then something else unexpected happens. And all of a sudden the period is over and you haven't even gotten to the objective. All right. Making sure that you have a clear beginning, a middle, and an end will help you plan for those things that come up, right? We also want clarity of language, which we've talked a lot about vocabulary and making sure that we have clear understanding of language, that we can trade language back and forth between teacher and student. We want consistency, which we talked about in part 2, our do now, right? We want meaningfulness, which is mainly what we're going to talk today about, all right? Making sure that our student has some buy-in so that what they're doing is just not pointless, right? They're not just practicing key commands to practice key commands. They're not learning JAWS just to learn JAWS, that there's meaning behind it, that this will help them later down the road. We want some novelty. So we don't want every single lesson to be the same. And of course, lastly, we want some fun to be involved, which is the whole point of this series. How do we make screen reader lessons fun? Okay. Now, some housekeeping here. We have materials today, the same materials that we have been offering this whole series, plus some other ones. The first one is, well, I guess I'll start with where do you find these? You can find them on the APH website under the materials for this webinar. And then we also have, Betsy, if we could throw that in the chat, we also have our Google Drive here. You can go onto the Google Drive and all of the materials and the PowerPoint are available there as well. All right. So the first thing that I want to show you is if we go into the materials folder in the Google Drive, and these are also all available on APH as well. The first thing I want to show you is, of course, our screen reader skills progression, which I think I already have open here. Our screen reader skills progression, remember, is the backbone of teaching screen readers. It's all of the objectives organized into a list and organized into phases. All right. We're going to be coming back to the screen reader skills progression today. All right. So if you're, this is the answer of the question, what do I teach? When you sit down and start teaching JAWS or start teaching NVDA or Chromevox or VoiceOver, these are the objectives. This is what you teach. All right. So where do I start? Where do I go next? That's where the screen reader skills progression comes in. The other thing that we have, and there's an accessible version on the APH website, is the lesson plan template. This is our accessible alternative. And the lesson plan template, the original, looks like this on the screen. And really this follows our series. Remember, in part 1, we talked about the instructional objective. We talked about the do now. We talked about the instruction and those components. And now we're at practice activity. So it really follows this series very nicely. The other thing that we commonly talk about is our screen reader cheat sheets, which is available on our website, which we'll talk about later. And then also we have all of these other things that we're going to talk about today that are unique to this particular webinar in this series. We have word sort, vocab story, navigation, Candyland, rules. All right. These are resources that are usually available in our paid screen reader curriculum, but we're offering today for free for this webinar. So definitely get those handouts because it's kind of a rare opportunity. So let me jump back to our PowerPoint here. So of course, what do I teach? The answer is the screen reader progression, that screen reader skills progression with all of the objectives. What are the key commands? Our screen reader cheat sheets, which is available for free on our website. Well, I'll show you that later in the webinar. And then how do I teach it? That's the lesson plan template. And that's offered today for free, okay, within that materials packet, okay? So those are our materials, plus some that are coming later in the webinar as well, all right? So let's talk about our 5 components. This is something that if you've seen parts 1 and 2, you're gonna be like, yes, coming back to the 5 components. First of all, the 5 components of an effective lesson, and I'm not saying screen reader lesson, I'm saying lesson just in general, is first we have an objective, of course, right? Second, we have a do now, which we talked about in part 2. Then, of course, we have the instruction. We have the practice activity, which is also known as our formative assessment. And then we have our assessment activity, which is the summative assessment. In parts 1 and 2, we did the objective, the do now, and the instruction. And of course, today in part 3, we're focusing on this component number 4, a practice activity. All right. So this is to just kind of set the stage for you. This is when you've sat down, you've identified your objective with your student, you've done your do now, you've done the actual instruction, done the what and why, talked about the vocabulary, talked about the key commands, identified the patterns, and now your student has received all of that instruction. and we're going to see if they can actually do it. All right. And of course, the easy way to do this is, okay, go ahead and do it. But today we're going to be showing you a couple of fun ways to show that objective has been met. All right. To show them that, or for them to show us that the objective has been met in a couple of fun ways. All right. Betsy, do we have any questions in the chat so far?
No, no questions in the chat so far.
All right, awesome. If those do come up, guys, feel free to put them in the chat because we love answering questions, okay? All right, so let's get started with a practice activity. What's the point? Why are we doing this, right? Why don't we just assess the objective, right? Well, there's a couple of points that we're going to outline here. First, it enhances the instruction, right? If you are a teacher of younger learners, you know that sometimes, and actually, if you're a teacher of anybody, you know that sometimes just telling somebody how to do something doesn't really show them how to do it, right? We all know people, including ourselves, that learn by doing, right? How many times have you tried to learn to do something and you listen to it, you might watch a video on it, you might hear somebody describe it, and you're like, I think I get it. But then when you actually do it, you're like, oh, I get it. I can explain this back to somebody. I can do this again. I can apply this to another situation. Doing something enhances the instruction, okay? Think back to part one when we did our instructional sequence. When I showed you, okay, I'm going to show you something with JAWS, and I showed you a whole instructional sequence. First, you do this, then you do this, then you do this, then you do this. And I said, this isn't a lesson. It's it's a instructional sequence. Why? And so many people put in the chat, because we didn't get to practice it. Exactly. That's exactly why it's not a lesson. This practice activity is the one thing that people forget, right? The one thing that most people forget when they do any sort of teaching, right? We say, okay, get it. We get it. We have to say the objective. I get it, right? Okay, now we have to do our instruction. Sounds good. Okay, now we have to assess if they actually met it. But what about that in-between period? What about that period where they're actually learning how to do something? That's the practice activity, okay? It enhances instruction. It also allows for we call covert assessment of our objective, all right? Covert assessment means that you're not necessarily assessing for actual data that is going to go into the student's file, and but you can sit there and look at what the student is doing and say, I don't think they get it yet. I think we're going to need another lesson on this, right? Covert assessment. You get to sit there and be the teacher, provide feedback, say, oh, you might do this a little bit differently. You might, maybe we'll do another lesson on this, right? And start to individualize this instruction for the actual student that's sitting in front of you. That's really, really important. If we don't have the practice activity, if we rush straight to assessment, we're taking away the opportunity for us to actually formatively assess what the student knows and what they can do, okay? And then finally, my favorite one is it's an opportunity for engagement. So we're going to call it fun, right? This is where the screen reader lesson, or the lesson in general, becomes fun, because we can add in all of these creative ideas that we're going to show today to actually make games and manipulatives and different activities, so that it's not just screen reader instruction. Doesn't have to be just sitting in front of a computer. We can make it fun. All right. So it's an opportunity to make it fun. All right, so that's kind of the point of a practice activity. That's what we're kind of wrapping our head around. So we're going to start with our first poll question, which is, of course, what is the purpose of a practice activity? And you're going to check all that apply. All right, does it enhance instruction? Does it increase memorization of key commands? Does it allow for covert assessment of the objective? Does it allow for students to practice skills to automaticity? Or is it an opportunity for engagement, AKA fun? Check all that apply here. All right. What is the purpose of a practice activity?
All right. And while folks are taking that poll, we did have a question come in. I know I missed the earlier sessions, but I noticed that on the skills progression reading, notice on skills progression, reading is the first phase. Yes. Where does navigating your computer with keyboard commands fit in your progression?
Yes, so pretty much That's a great question. Navigating your computer with keyboard commands is the entire progression. We call the first phase reading because especially our philosophy at IT is that screen reader instruction and using a screen reader doesn't exist outside of anything, right? So navigating a computer with key commands, that is what you're doing the entire progression. But what are you doing what are you doing? What are you using that to do? Well, in the first phase, we're going to do reading, which means you're going to be using key commands on your computer to read, right? And the second phase is writing, right? You're going to be using keyboard commands to write and edit text, right? So the whole progression is using keyboard commands and navigating, actually. But it just is, what are you actually trying to do? Are you reading? Are you writing? Are you using the internet? Are you moving files around? And that's kind of just our reminder for people that screen reader instruction does not stop with navigating and key commands, right? That's not what screen reader instruction is. It's really using a computer. What are you using a computer for? You're using it to read, you're using it to write, you're using it to use the internet, you're using, so that's a great question. It really comes down to kind of our philosophy and what we're trying to put out into the world, so yeah, great question.
And we had another question come in. What is the third phase?
The third phase is using the internet. So it's probably I shouldn't say probably, it is the largest phase of the screen reader skills progression. I can show you that here. Let me show you. Oh, there we go. So our first phase, reading, second phase, writing, and then the third phase, look at how long this is, using the internet. And the reason is that the third phase is so long is because there's so many variables on the internet. There's many things that you have to do. And you'll see that if you read through the first half of phase 3 of using the internet is all really, they're very literal level skills. So using method 1, being able to define common elements on the internet, headings, buttons, links. These are all literal level objectives. But then once you get down to objective 7 in phase 3, look at this. Be able to justify why he or she selected a particular method for the situation. These at the bottom, these are just as important, but they're much more applied skills, right? They're much more conceptual. It makes the student have to have an understanding of the internet. So that's why it's so long. And that's phase 3. And then phase 4, system navigation and file management. This is really the complex skills on the computer, moving around files, opening File Explorer, using applications like Google Drive, being able to download material from the internet, really advanced skills beyond just navigating the internet and gaining information. So that's the long-winded answer for that question.
Thank you, Cody. We've had about 64% participate in our poll, so take another look at that if you missed it. And we will review our answers as we've got our final responses coming in. What is the purpose of a practice activity? Check all that apply. Your options were enhances instruction, increases memorization of key commands, allows for covert assessment of the objective, allows for student to practice skills to automaticity, and opportunity for engagement, aka fun. So 95% said that it enhances instruction. 91% says that it allows for covert assessment of the objective. 91% says it's an opportunity for engagement, aka fun. And then our two categories with the lowest responses were at 65% allows for student to practice skills to automaticity, and at 60% increases memorization of key commands. And we'll end the poll with that. And Cody, I'll turn it back to you to let us know which one of these were correct.
Yeah, so our correct answers in this were number 1, enhances instruction, right? It always enhances instruction, just like that learning by doing, like we had just talked about. It also allows for covert assessment of the objective, right? Remember, that allows you to sit there and watch your student and be a teacher, provide that feedback, do whatever they need to actually understand that objective. And then it allows for an opportunity for engagement. It's an opportunity for engagement, or AKA fun. Those are the correct answers. Now, increases memorization of key commands. Remember, and this is more of a philosophical answer. But remember, I am never a proponent of memorizing key commands. You shouldn't be memorizing key commands. You should be learning them. Now people are like, okay, well, that's just pragmatics, right? What does that even mean? But really think about it like this. Instead of opening a screen reader manual and saying, I need to memorize this entire manual, all of the key commands in here, a student should be able to sit down at a computer and figure out a key command. Okay. When I say figure out a key command, they should say, okay, well, I know that Alt key commands are for menus, and I'm trying to get to a menu, and the menu I'm trying to get to is the options menu. So maybe the key command is Alt plus O. That's not memorizing, that's figuring it out. If you do proper screen reader instruction, you shouldn't be memorizing. You should be saying Alt commands are always for menus, right? Showing those patterns. Okay. So never memorize key commands. Make sure you learn them. Okay. And then allows for students to practice skills to automaticity. There is a part of the screen of the lesson plan template that allows for that, but it's the do now. All right. So go back to part 2. If you like that, allows for students to practice skills to automaticity. That was our last webinar. Our practice activity shouldn't be practicing skills to automaticity. It shouldn't be tedious, right? It should be fun. It should be expanding knowledge. It should be thinking about things in a different way, applying the skill to a different situation, really elaborating on your students' knowledge, not necessarily practicing those tedious skills. There is an opportunity for that. It's at the beginning of the lesson in the do now. So watch that part 2. Okay, cool. So nice job on that, everybody. We'll move on here to the question, how do I make a practice activity fun? Well, there's 3 different ways that we're going to talk about today. All right. There's 2 ways that are optional, 1 way that is not optional. We'll start with the optional ways first. First of all, you can incorporate movement, right? This is the easiest way. You can get out from behind the computer and you can make an activity where the student has to move around their environment. You're sitting there thinking, how is that even possible with screen reader instruction? I'll show you today. That's the point of today. Opening our brain, opening our minds, and kind of thinking outside the box when it comes to movement activities with screen reader instruction. It can be done. We've done it before. Another optional way to make a practice activity fun is competition. All right. This is kind of hard when you're itinerant, but if you work at a school for the blind, or if you're itinerant and you're remote, doing remote instruction, or you have remote tools like Google Meet or Zoom, and you have that opportunity to get multiple students involved, that competition makes activities that are usually very boring, very fun if you get that energy level up. You can also compete with your student, which I see a lot of really great TVIs in the field doing, is competing with their students and making that fun competition. Makes a lot of, like I said, a lot of boring activities, a lot of fun. And then the not optional way to make a practice activity fun. This is the only way that you can actually make a practice activity fun, is to make it task oriented. Okay. That goes back to that meaningfulness factor. If you are having a student, and I'll go back to this example that we talked about in part 2. If you're having a student say, okay, we just learned how to turn on a screen reader. Now I want you to turn on your screen reader and then turn it off 10 times for practice. That's not task oriented, right? There's no reason that the student is going to need to do that. When would you ever need to turn on and off a screen reader 10 times? If I was sitting at my computer in the morning and I had to turn my computer on and off 10 times, I probably would be going crazy, right? That doesn't make any sense. So make sure that it's task oriented, that the task that you're asking your student is real life, that it makes sense, that they're going to buy into it. Okay, so that's the not optional part. So movement, competition, task oriented. All right. So now we'll get into the actual practice activities, and this is going to go back and forth between the slideshow and the materials that I showed you, and some things with them where I'm sharing my screen. So we're gonna, and before we even get into these activities, I'm going to kind of explain to you how we're going to organize them. So first of all, if you take a look at these activities, I have the name of the activity, which I'm going to be real with you, I made all of these up. Part of the difficulty of this webinar was making up names of activities that I've done in the past, to be absolutely real with you. But then also, so after the name, it also says the task, because remember, all of these have to be task oriented. Okay. So what is the task that they're doing? We're going to start with vocabulary. Okay. So we're just going to start with learning vocabulary words. Now, if you've done any of our content in the past, you'll know vocabulary is very, very important to us. And actually in our screen reader skills progression, remember I said this is the backbone of everything we do at IT. All of our vocabulary words are underlined. So for example, we'll say in phase 1 reading, students will, objective 2 says, be able to utilize modifier keys such as Control, Alt, Shift, and Shift to enter a modified key command. Okay, so those vocabulary words, modifier keys and modified key commands, remember, we recommend teaching those vocabulary words before you even teach the objective. What is a modifier key? What is a modified key command? Let's have some examples, right? And the first set of practice activities that we're going to review today talks about only learning vocabulary. So this does not involve key commands, right? It doesn't involve key commands. It doesn't involve doing anything on the computer. It just involves vocabulary. Okay. So let's kind of go through them. First of all, we have vocab stories. The task in vocab stories, what we want our student to do is to name and identify vocabulary words. I've included a vocab story in our materials today, and I'm going to show it to you now. A vocab story is a story that really incorporates the vocabulary words that we want our student to learn. Now, the fun thing about vocab stories is that a student can just read the story and just, become accustomed to seeing the word, but you'll see that's not really doing anything, right? The practice activity comes from reading the story. What I usually do, and you can modify this as you wish, but what I usually do is I read the story aloud to a student, and I give a student like a game show buzzer. You can get them on Amazon for like $15. And when they hear a vocabulary word that we've gone over, all right, they hit that game show buzzer, and then I say, great, awesome. What was the vocabulary word? They have to tell me the vocabulary word, and then what does it mean in the context of screen readers? And then they have to define it. So it gives us kind of a unique way where they're sitting and listening to a story. We're not on a computer. We're not doing key commands. We're kind of taking a break from all that, but they're learning the actual vocabulary words, which is really, really, really important as well. I'm going to read to you guys this vocab story. So I'm going to go back to actually, you know what? I'm going to just open another one. All right. I'm going to read to you guys our vocab story, and you guys can follow along with me, but it'll kind of give you the idea of what a vocab story is. Okay. So this is just a story with vocabulary words in it. The vocabulary words that are in this story are internet vocabulary words. They're element, text, heading, link, button, graphic, and edit field. Okay, so those are the vocabulary words in this particular lesson that we're looking for. So if you are my student, I would start reading. When you hear one of those words, you hit that game show buzzer. I'm going to read the first sentence. This story is called Pop Quiz. It was an 8 a.m. sharp as the bell rang for period 1. Corey grabbed his backpack from under his chair in homeroom and began heading to chemistry class. All right, there's our first vocabulary word, right? It's kind of out of context, so it makes you really think and really listen. But that's our vocabulary word, is heading. You see it underlined in my vocab story. So if I was the student, and this is one that it always catches my students off guard because they're like, that wasn't what heading means. I know, you have to listen. If you were the student, you'd hit that game show buzzer and you'd say heading, right? And I'd say, great, what is a heading? And you should say title or section title, which is what a heading actually means on the internet, right? The next sentence reads, on the way, he linked up with Sam, who saw him standing at the water fountain. Again, there's another vocabulary word, linked, right? It's not really linked, but link is a vocabulary word. All right. If you were the student, you'd hit that game show buzzer and say link. I'd say, what does link mean? You say a way to get to another web page, right? Whatever the definition you've defined with your learner. Okay. So you're thinking about this as this is kind of our first understanding of this is what a practice activity looks like, a way to step back from, not necessarily step back from the computer, but step back from the drudgery of usually using, doing those traditional screen reader lessons and really thinking about what we're learning and applying it to different situations, right? Opening our mind, right? This is kind of an abstract one. Most of the vocab ones will be. So let's take a look at some other ones. Oh, from current slide. Boom, there we go. The next one, vocab game show, task, name and identify vocabulary words. The same thing is you can actually, what you can do is the same concept with those game show buzzers, but instead of reading a whole vocab story, you can actually open up your screen reader. You as the teacher, open up your screen reader and go through elements on the internet, right? And when you stop on one, right? So let's say you stop on a link, the student has to ring in and say, okay, that's the name of a link. So it's kind of the same idea as a vocab story, but instead of reading a story, you as the teacher are actually navigating on the internet. All right. So that's just another modification to that game. Word sort. All right. Word sort is one of my favorites. You can do this. I gave you one that is a remote one, but you can do this in person as well with some manipulatives. I'll show you that now. All right. So word sort is all you do is make a list of all of the vocabulary words that you're learning. All right. These could be word by word, letter by letter, modified key commands, modifier keys, any of those vocabulary words. In this case, I'm using button, text, graphic, visited link, text element, link, right? All the internet key command or all the internet vocabulary words. And all you're doing is putting them into categories. So for example, if you're familiar with the difference between clickable objects and text elements, right? Clickable objects being elements that you can click on, text elements being elements that only give you information, right? You do that sort of lesson, you can say, all right, well, I am going to sort my vocabulary words into clickable objects and text elements, right? So then what you would do is you could do this either with manipulatives, or you can do this by putting I can be on the computer and put like a star in front of one group, a dash in front of another. And all you're doing is sorting vocabulary words into different categories. What does this do? It really provides a more expanded understanding of all of the vocabulary words that we're learning, okay? And then finally, let me present again. Slideshow from current slide. I said Accessibyte quick cards. If you're familiar with Accessibyte is the company that makes Typeo, but they have a really great application called Quick Cards. And it's really just a vocab or a index card or a vocab card application where you can make a stack of index cards or make a stack of virtual vocabulary words. And you can not only have your student practice with those cards, but you can also test them through the application, which is really cool too. So that's something that I use pretty commonly is with Accessibyte. All right. Do we have any questions in the chat on any of these practice activities, Betsy?
One came in as you were going into these vocabulary practice techniques.
Mm-hmm.
Where can I find a list of command patterns such as Alt plus blank has to do with menus? Is there like a quick reference somewhere of where those patterns can be found?
No, there's not. That's something that we cover in our screen reader curriculum, which is a paid course. But we haven't really created a reference sheet of those patterns. That might be something that I haven't really thought about, but that would be really cool to create in the future. But no, I don't. And most of those patterns, like the one that I just said, I don't know if I came up with it, but it's not something that's commonly used. But it's something that we can certainly look into. I know our screen reader cheat sheets is a reference guide that's commonly used. We could probably do something very similar with a list of patterns for the internet. That would be really cool. So thank you for that. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for that. But cool. All right, so let's keep going. So what we're going to do from here on is we're going to go through these practice activities based on the phases of the screen reader skills progression. So like we said, our phase 1 is reading, our phase 2 is writing, and phase 3, the internet. We're just going to be doing those 3 phases today. But what we'll do is we'll first talk about the phase and the objectives in the phase, and then we'll give you some practice activities that you could use with your learner that's learning objectives in that phase. All right. So let's first start with the phase 1, reading. All right. So reading, really what we're trying to incorporate here is gaining information from the computer. This is our beginner base level screen reader, somebody that has never used a screen reader before, has never used JAWS, NVDA, Chromevox. And all they're doing is getting used to using the screen reader, number 1, and then getting information from it in the easiest way possible. So I'm just going to read out these objectives. There's 6 of them. So if you ever see our content, we'll label this as 1.1, as in phase 1, objective 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. So 1.1 is students will be able to turn on and off a screen reader, right? That's the base level. First thing you need to learn how to do. 1.2, be able to utilize modifier keys such as Control, Alt, and Shift to enter a modified key command. An example of this is Control left arrow or Control right arrow. 1.3, to be able to use to read text using a variety of reading commands. All right. So whoever the person that said, where does navigating and using key commands come in? This is it. The first one is the 3rd objective. So it's really the whole progression. 1.4, to be able to identify the titles and section titles of documents with headings. 1.5, to be able to access documents, open and close programs, and be able to navigate easily to the desktop. And 1.6, to be able to switch program focus. So this is kind of the space that we're existing in. All right. Students that are in this phase really are focusing on reading commands. All right. Reading commands, moving around in documents like Microsoft Word. I use a lot of, if you're familiar with FS Reader, I use FS Reader with students in this that are learning in this phase. And even some accessible PDFs. If we can get an accessible PDF open, this is really a great starting for a practice activity. All right. So let's take a look at some of the practice activities that we have in this phase. The first one is read a story of interest, right? The whole point of this phase is reading, right? So what are we going to do for practice? Well, we're going to read a story. The great thing about this is that you could read any story and practice this activity. A lot of times we say, all right, you're going to read this story. Well, why not read a story that the student is interested in, right? They're interested in puppies, give them a story about puppies, right? A lot of people say, when should I start screen reader instruction? Guess what? If you start at this level, I've started this practice activity and this lesson with students in 1st grade. So as early as possible to get them on a computer. Any 1st grader we can teach to well, I shouldn't say any, but most 1st graders that are academic, we can teach them to read a story using a screen reader, right? So read a story of interest. The task is find all of the silly words or find all of the misspelled words. So of course, we don't want them to just read a story, right? They read a story, great. But we want to see them practice, right? So we want to have them read a story and do something, right? Because we want to keep them engaged. If we say, read a story about puppies, what are they going to do? They're going to press the down arrow key, down, 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 down. Okay, I finished the story. But if we say, okay, now I want you to find all of the silly words, right? If you take a story and you replace all of the some words in there with like silly words, right? With things that don't make a lot of sense, then you can say, all right, tell me when you find a silly word. And then you can start, oh, you missed one. What about this one? And then you can laugh. And, you know, with younger learners, this is a great practice activity, right? Or for older learners, find all of the words that are misspelled, right? If you are familiar with reading commands, you can see the difference here. Finding silly words, you can do that with line by line. With up and down arrow key, you can find silly words. but finding all of the misspelled words, if you have an older learner or a learner that is learning to read letter by letter and really learning to edit, finding all of the misspelled words is a little bit of a harder task, right? Because they have to read, they have to get to the word, they have to listen to the screen reader, and they have to see if they can find that word letter by letter. It's a really, really challenging task. So reading a story of interest, great, easy start, but then here's some scaffolded activities that you can also include. All right. We can come back to vocab stories too. All right. Find all of the vocabulary words. Now you might be saying, you just showed us that activity, but this is a different activity in that the first activity in the vocab story, I was reading the vocab story to you, my learner, but in this iteration, the learner is reading the vocab story and finding all of the vocabulary words. All right. This is where practice activities become really, really valuable, because not only is our student reading a story and actually applying reading commands, applying the task that we've taught them in instruction, but they're also learning their vocabulary words by finding those vocabulary words in the story. All right. So those are some ideas for practice activities for reading. All right. I will interject here and say, when I used to teach at Maryland School for the Blind, my first grade class, we used to do these activities all the time. And it was so much fun because then students could share stories back and forth with each other. They could say, oh, I really like this story. And they would share it with their friend and they would get that story in the next class. Reading stories of interest, you might think is a 1 or 2 lesson practice activity, but you can, when you're creative with it and when you're creative with how you present it, you could really make this a multi-unit or a multi-lesson 1 unit practice activity. All right. You could also go and find the heading of the story, find a title with headings, make it a heading. So many things that you can do by just reading stories. All right. So that's our reading practice activities. Do we have any questions in the chat so far?
No questions in the chat.
All right, cool. So now we move on to phase 2, which is writing. All right. A lot of times we will see this as typing or keyboarding, right? But instead of typing or keyboarding, let's bring it back to real world, right? We don't all, well, we do kind of live on computers, but hopefully we don't want to live on computers. So we can call this writing. Okay. So the objectives in this phase are 2.1 is students will be able to type with all alphanumeric keys on a keyboard. That's a large objective, right? I always say phase 2 looks really short, but that first objective is huge, right? Type with all alphanumeric keys on the keyboard. That's something that we're not necessarily going to touch in this webinar, just because it could be a whole series of webinars. But just to let you know, phase 1 or phase 2 looks short, but it's really not. 2.2, to be able to navigate to and through screen reader settings. So that's getting to the screen reader, opening settings and changing something in there. 2.3, to be able to write and edit documents using a basic understanding of cursor placement. All right, that's a really large objective too. Understanding that cursor placement and where the cursor is on the line. A lot of times I'll say when I used to be a technology instructor, I would get documents back from my student and the document is all over the place, right? And I always used to struggle as an instructor and say, like, how do I get my students to really understand where they are in the document? If you're a TVI and you teach academic learners, you might be like, yeah, I see that a lot too. And I think we fail to realize that unless a student knows where their cursor is, where they start typing, it's really difficult to understand where you are in that document. So that 2.3, really big objective, write and edit documents with a basic understanding of cursor placement. And then 2.4, to be able to select, copy, and paste text. All right. So that's writing. That's phase 2. All right. So what are the practice activities in here? And before I even go to practice activities, really to wrap this objective up, the point of this, to wrap this phase up, the point of this phase is to start inputting information into the computer. Remember, phase 1 was, let me get information from the computer. Phase 2 is putting information back into the computer. So how can we get our students to start putting information into the computer? All right, so let's see these practice activities. All right, so we start with Mad Libs. All right, if you are familiar with Mad Libs, Mad Libs is, it usually comes in like a packet book, probably from the Dollar General, and a pack of 5 for like $1. And what it is, you know, you start by saying, okay, give me a verb, give me an adjective, give me a noun, give me a adverb, right? And then those words that you placed randomly get put into a story. And of course, it becomes very silly because you haven't seen the story yet. And we can do this exact same activity, what we all remember as being really fun and silly from childhood. We can put this into a screen reader. We can put this on the computer. The task being read a story and place your own words in the brackets. That's kind of our modified Mad Libs. So if you give your student a story, you see how this is building off our practice activities from phase 1. And you say, I've deleted some words and I put brackets in their place. The student then has to move their cursor between the brackets and insert their own words, right? Now, this is really fun and engaging because for our really silly and really engaged learners, or even for our learners that have a special interest of their own, they want to be able to share with you, right? How many times have you had a learner that, you know, you're like, okay, stop talking, we have to learn. Well, use that excitement and say, okay, I want you to write all of this in a story, all right? Insert these special interest words, right? About roller coasters or trains or whatever they're interested in, put them in brackets, right? And then they are forced to use that cursor placement. They're forced to use reading commands. They're forced to be able to have to type, right? And then they can share with you their special interests in a story form at the end, okay? Then the scaffolded form of that is write a list of words in a Word document, and now you have to select them, copy them, and paste them into the brackets. That's the next level, right? So you can see how Mad Libs, just this engaging activity, we can use that to our advantage and create a really fun and engaging activity that covertly, remember, assesses our objective, right? It covertly assesses our objective. And you can modify this activity to fit the objective that you're trying to assess, right? Read a story of interest. You're like, we've already gone over this. Yes, but wait, it's modified. The task is to replace 3 to 5 words with silly words, okay? So they read their story of interest and their assignment being now replace them with silly words or replace them with different words. It doesn't have to be silly. But what does that have make them do? Well, it makes them use their reading commands to read the story. It makes them find a word by word, that they want to replace, put their cursor in the right spot, delete the word, and put a new word in. It's a lot of things. And you can delete or you can modify that as you need to, right? Yeah, story of interest, replace them with silly words, replace words with silly words. Cursor manipulatives. I've done this so many times with wiki sticks. The task is using manipulatives, place the cursor between the right words. So really what I would recommend is you have a sentence written in Braille, you cut up all the little words, right? And just for placement, I usually put them on Velcro on like a felt board. And then you have a little piece of wiki stick, right? And you can say, you can have your screen reader reading, right? The sentence on the computer. And then when you stop, say, okay, where is my cursor? And have them put the cursor, this wiki stick, between the right 2 words that your screen reader's cursor is between, all right? So if it says, the cat sat on the mat, and you read that, the cat sat, where's my cursor, right? And then they have to put the cursor on their manipulatives, all right? So this is a really great activity for students that are very spatially motivated, right? That are very good at O&M, but still haven't learned a computer. It really, again, practice activities is a fun and engaging way to get out from in front of the computer, to take a break from the screen reader, right? And use movement as a source of engagement, right? And then finally, in phase 2, misspelled mystery. The task is read a story or group of sentences and find and correct the misspelled words, all right? Again, having them read the story, find and correct the misspelled words. You said, oh, that sounds a lot like the last activity, but finding and correcting the misspelled words, not just finding them, but finding and correcting them makes them go through with their cursor, find where the mistake is, delete the letter and put the letter in. A lot more difficult than our first one. All right. So those are our practice activities for writing. Do we have any questions so far?
Yeah, we had a few come in.
Yeah.
One was an idea for a lesson, really
love
jumping
it.
off some of the ideas that you've shared.
Yeah.
Create a doc of sentences out of order and have them correct it with editing. For advanced students, they can correct the order of the words in a sentence.
Yes, absolutely. Anytime, any idea like that you can start to see that all of these are running off of each other. But anytime that, especially for phase 2, we have to take text and move it somewhere else and bring it around the document. That's all great. Those are all great practice activities. Yeah. Awesome.
And there's some interest in learning more about cursor manipulatives, and what are the ways that you can create those.
Yeah. So what I've done before is I've actually had students have a binder. So then when they walk into my room or they walk into my service as an itinerant, I have a binder with just felt on it. I mean, you could also use the Wheatley board from that APH provides and have them open it up. And then what you do is create a sentence. This can be or a bunch of words, and put little Velcro stickies on the back of each one of those words in Braille, right? And then what you can do is you can create a sentence, right? And Velcro it on the Wheatley board or Velcro it on the binder. And then when you do the cursor manipulative, you can simulate where that cursor is just with a little piece of wiki stick. So for example, what I would do in this activity is I would open up my screen reader. I'd have the same sentence on my computer that the student has in Braille on their binder or on their Wheatley board. And I would say, all right, this is kind of like musical chairs. Wherever I stop, you stop. I would read word by word, or, word by word, probably. I would read word by word, and wherever I stop, the student has to put their cursor in the same spot. And then I can check their work and I can say, oh, that's not where I stopped. Let me do it again. And the benefit of doing that is that the student gets to physically move that cursor so that they start to understand how cursors move on the computer with the screen reader. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more detail as to how to do that. Cool. Any other questions, or that's all we got?
Yeah, 2 comments just want to share.
Yeah.
Using a green slot board could be quicker than Velcro.
Cool.
And
yeah.
A more basic, looking for a more basic explanation of cursor placement. For example, do you use Word document and use screen reader for writing practice?
Kind of. So cursor placement with this particular activity, and I can totally, let me just check time. Yeah, we got
30 minutes. Yeah.
So what I can do actually is, let me add a new document. Let me open up Microsoft Word here, and let me just write out a simple sentence. The cat sat on the mat, right? Let me increase the font here, and let me turn on a screen reader. Whoop. All right. So I'll turn on NVDA because it's nice and quick, but I promise, this works the same way in JAWS.
Taskbar.
Or VoiceOver, or it doesn't work the same way in VoiceOver. If you're interested in VoiceOver, it's a little bit different. But it works the same way in JAWS. It works the same way in Chromevox.
Document one word.
So what I would do is, let's say this is the sentence that I have on my computer and I'm ready to go. The student has the same sentence in Braille on their mat or just on a piece of Braille paper. And I've given them a little piece of wiki stick that represents the cursor here. All right. And my directive to them is, I say, I'm going to read this sentence and I'm going to stop somewhere. And your directive is, you need to stop. You need to put your cursor where I stop. So let's try it. I'm going to use my reading commands here. That's word by word, control and right arrow. Okay.
Cat, sat, on, boot.
And that's where I'm going to stop. Now, if I was doing a lesson here, I would say, okay, where did I stop? right? And we would have already talked about how the screen reader says the word that's to the right. So they should put their cursor, their little wiki stick between on and the. And I can check over. And if they've put it in the wrong spot, I can say, oh, that's not right. Let me do it again.
Cat, boot, cat, set, on, boot.
All right. And then I can give them a prompt. Remember, the screen reader says the word that's to the right of the cursor. So put your cursor so that the is to the right of it. All right. And that can be our prompt so that I can actually see if our student has really absorbed that information that I've given to them. I hope that's kind of clarifies things. Perhaps if it didn't,
Show Braille viewer on startup.
let me make sure that I shut off NVDA
Exit
first.
NVDA dialog.
If it didn't, definitely follow up in the chat and we can try to fit that in as well. All right. Cool. All right, so let's move on to phase 3 here. Oh, I'm sorry, just kidding. Pop quiz. This is our second poll question. What are the 3 ways to make a practice activity fun? And this is check all that apply. Is it discussion, movement? Is it task-oriented, reflection, or competition? What are the 3 ways to make a practice activity fun? And that's a check all that apply question.
Great. And we've gone through all of the questions that have come in so far, but the chat is open if you'd like to drop a question for Cody. And we've had about 55% complete this poll so far. Let us know if there's if you've got any questions about the poll. You can always drop your response in the chat instead of using the poll if that's an issue. All right. Well, we're about 65% completed in the poll. So while the remaining group is responding, I will review your question again. What are 3 ways to make a practice activity fun? Check all that apply. It was a multiple choice and you had 5 options. They were discussion, movement, task-oriented, reflection, and competition. We had 2 choices that both scored 100%, and those were movement and competition. The next largest category at 80% was task-oriented. And we had 2 categories that only got 3 votes apiece, and those were reflection and discussion. Cody, could you let us know which the correct responses are as I close down this poll?
Yeah, absolutely. So this one, remember, there's 2 optional and 1 mandatory. The mandatory one, the thing that we want to make sure that our practice activity is task oriented. We want to make sure that the practice activity is meaningful and there's a clear task that the student has to do, right? The other that are optional but are still important are movement and competition. And you can see all of my practice activities that I've shared so far are task oriented, but not all of them include movement and not all of them include competition, all right? Discussion and reflection are great components to a lesson, but in the practice activity, remember, it's more about doing than about talking, right? We want to make sure that we're doing more in the practice activity, allowing the student to do more things, all right, than to talk about them. But that's discussion and reflection are great for the end of a lesson for sure. So great job on that, guys. All right, we'll move on to our phase 3, which is the internet. All right. And of course, this is the longest phase. And then there's 2 slides of this, but I'm going to quickly run through and I'm going to paraphrase these just for the sake of time. Our 3.1 objective is to define common elements of the internet, right? Headings, buttons, links, tables. Our 3.2 objective is to be able to identify each element by type. That is when they hear it, a screen reader land on one that they can tell that's what it is. Usually what happens is, for example, if this was an internet page and phase 3, the internet objectives was the heading, it would say, our screen reader would say, phase 3, the internet objectives, heading level 1, that our student can actually be able to say, oh, that's a heading at level 1. 3.3 to be able to navigate to the address bar. Objectives 4, 5, and 6 are our 3 methods of internet navigation. If you're not familiar with that, the screen reader curriculum, basic internet navigation, that's where we teach that on our website, which I'll show you that at the end. But that is navigating by clickable object, quick keys, and elements lists. Okay, so those are 3 methods of navigation that are really important for the internet. Then we're going to go on to, this actually goes on to, the numbering is wrong here, but that's okay. The next objective is the student will be able to justify why he or she uses a particular method, why they use elements lists, why they use quick keys. They'll be able to switch tab focus. They'll be able to switch between screen reader modes, navigate a table, and be able to use the navigation sequence. Now you might be thinking, oh my gosh, this is so much information. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about these objectives. The only thing you have to worry about is that this phase covers the internet. So as we move on to the practice activities, don't get overwhelmed with the objectives. Now, the practice activities, all right? There are a lot here, but we'll go through each one. We totally have time to go through each one. So the first one we call Navigation Candyland. This is one of our favorites, and it's actually available in our screen reader curriculum. Navigation Candyland, it's exactly what it sounds like. If you've ever played the game Candyland, what you do is you pick up cards, and the cards tell you how many spaces to move on the board. Super simple game. But what we're going to do is, instead of using a board and cards, we are going to use a website, right? So instead of cards, we actually provide you with a spinner. It's a free spinner that's available online, and we've already loaded it in with movements, right? And I'm going to show you this in a second. And what you're going to do is you're going to play with multiple students, or you against the student, and you're going to race to the end of the website. All right. On our screen reader curriculum, we actually provide you with a mock website where none of the links work, none of the buttons work. You can't get lost. And that's what we provide to you. But you could also do this with any website on the internet, right? If you go to apple.com and you say, we're going to play Navigation Candyland at apple.com, we're going to race to the end of the website using different methods of internet navigation. Really, really, really fun game. I'm going to show it to you now. So I'm first going to show you our rules document that we provided to you guys. Make sure that I have this up. Of course, there we go. Now, let me make sure it's in our Google Drive. It's also available on the handouts. But if we go to Navigation Candyland rules, this is the entire document of how to play. All right. We have a description. We have the object of the game, the setup, the gameplay. We also have our spinners. So I'm going to show you these spinners here. All right. So this is a free spinner available online. And it's already loaded in with appropriate movements. So you'll see, I need to get closer here. Move forward by 2 clickable objects. Move backwards by 1 clickable object, right? Down arrow key 1 time. So these are all applicable moves. And what you can do is you can open up a website, click on the spinner. I know it's a terrible sound. I'm so sorry. And if I was the student, my move would be, I would use 1 down arrow key. And if I had a screen reader on, all of this reads, we checked it for accessibility. So they can operate the spinner, you can operate the spinner, you can operate the spinner for 2 students, doesn't matter, however you modify it. But I would move 1 down arrow key, I would go down 1 down arrow key, and then the next person would move. The benefit of Navigation Candyland is, as you get to more complicated spinners, because we've made 3 spinners for you. Spinner number 1 is pretty basic, just includes method 1. Spinner 2 includes methods 1 and 2, and spinner 3 includes all 3 methods. You can see how efficient some methods are over others. So you can see this one that I just opened up not only includes move forward by 1 clickable object, but it also says use elements list to move to the link you win at the bottom, right? To move to a specific link. If you get that elements list one, you win, right? That's it. If you get move forward by 1 heading, it's going to move you real far down that website, right? A lot farther than you would get if you just do 1 down arrow key. So it's a fun, competitive way that's task oriented to practice these methods of navigation, right? It's not just let's go through a website and research an article, right? It's a fun, competitive game, all right? So that's what we're kind of trying to get to with these practice activities. So that's Navigation Candyland. The rules are there. We also have our links to our mock websites. If you are registered for the screen reader curriculum, those links will work. But again, you can play it with any website you want. All right, so that's Navigation Candyland. We're really excited about that one. Let me make sure I present here. The next one is our Google search challenge. All right, the task is to find an answer to the question. All right, the Google search challenge is really easy. It's just a Google search. But if you go to, let me make a new tab. If you go to Google for Education, Google search challenge, Google for Education has made a lot of Google search challenges, and they're all right here. And you'll take a look at them. They're very, very, very creative and very hard to find. But you'll see that it really takes a lot of problem solving to find some of the answers to these questions. And they have beginner, intermediate, and advanced questions. So yeah, so take a look at this. All right, Google search challenges are really awesome. Or if you don't want to do that, you can also just search for a topic of interest. The only reason we say Google search challenge and look up that Google for Education is because a lot of times with technology instruction, we say, okay, we want to include the learner. And we say to the learner, okay, what do you want to search up? And they say, what do I want to search? And you sit there and wait for them to, if we already have a search available to them, it's great. If they want to search up something and use their skills of navigating around the internet to search for something, that is fine too. The other thing about a Google search challenge is this could, if a student is pretty advanced and knows those methods of navigation, you could make this a do now, right? You could say, okay, here's your Google search challenge for the day, and that could be their do now. So that's something that I've definitely done in the past. Role playing or follow along, right? The task is to follow directions and try to keep up. This task that really came to fruition because I was thinking about my students that are going on to college and them sitting in a college class or in some sort of college class, maybe the first day, and the instructor saying, okay, we're going to learn how to use Blackboard because you're all freshmen, and I know that you might not know how to use Blackboard or Canvas or whatever they use. And this is how you do it. Step one, go to my account. Up in the top hand corner, it's a link. Step two is go to, what my class is called blah, 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 right? And it's a link. And I'm thinking about my students being like, oh my gosh, they not only need to know what I'm talking about, right, with my vocabulary words and screen readers, but they also need to know what sighted people who don't know how to use screen readers say, right? So the role-playing follow-along game is the way that I set it up is pretend that you're in a college class and I'm the professor and I'm trying to guide you through something, right? Usually I say going to the university library, going to your account, something. And I don't know how to use a screen reader. So I'm going to be saying all these different words, links, buttons, and I'm going to be using them interchangeably. And your job is to try to keep up with me. All right. And that's a skill that it gets really competitive if you have two students. And it also allows the student to beat their time. So if you continue a routine, we're going to get to the university library. You can say, all right, it took you 10 minutes to do these 5 steps. Let's see if we can beat our time next time. So that's just one way to kind of really tie it back to real world. The next one is a link puzzle. All right, a link puzzle is a movement activity, and the task is to place web pages in logical order. A link puzzle is if you have a large class of students, or if you have one student, you give them a bunch of links, right? So if your links are animals, gorillas, chimpanzees, all of these links that could be on the internet, they have to put them in a logical order. Okay, so where am I going to find a link about gorillas? Is it going to be under a link that says page that says chimpanzees, or is it going to be under a page that says monkeys, right? How are you going to expect to navigate the internet? And that's a really fun task to do with a class of students, because then they get to discuss and move themselves around. A table search, also really fun movement activity. This is where, and this is really a story. I was running a screen reader camp about probably 4 years ago in Baltimore for the Maryland School for the Blind. And I had 6 students and they all had to learn how to use a screen reader really quickly. And this is one of the things that we did to break up the day. So I made a big table in like a computer table in the library, and I made it with yarn and tape, and it had rows and it had columns and it had a header row, and it was just taped down to the floor, right? So then what we would do is we would crawl around this table and count rows and count columns and do different things, okay? Really crazy, really insane, definitely a summer camp thing, but if you have the space and you have the resources, super, super fun. Some things that we did was I would place a piece of candy on a cell in this table, and they would be blindfolded, and then they'd have to run their hands along the table and find that piece of candy only with a cell number. So we were actually learning Excel, and I said, okay, the piece of candy is in D5, and they would have to find D5. So that means they have to orient themselves to the header row, and they'd have to count across A, B, C, D, and then down 5, right? You could also do this where team members are giving directions saying, oh, it's down 5 rows, and they have a replica on a piece of cardboard, and they're helping their teammate along. So lots of really cool things to really understand how tables work if you make a big, huge table on the floor, but that's also a crazy idea. So I understand if you don't do it. I wouldn't be upset. And then finally, our final practice activity that I recommend here is building a navigation sequence. Now, if you've attended some of our webinars before, not necessarily on APH, but you've seen me before, I talk a lot about navigation sequences, and it's really the steps that you take to navigate a certain website. Maybe it's first you go to this link, then you go to this button. And the task being to put that navigation sequence in a logical order. All right. First, you go to the login link. Is that going to be the first thing you do or the 5th thing you do? It's going to be the first thing you do, right? So putting that navigation sequence in a logical order, using manipulatives. All right. So I know that was a lot of information very quickly. As you can see, we're running a little low on time, but I wanted to give some chance for questions at this point in our webinar. Are there any questions that came through in the chat?
No, we did have a suggestion of another activity from Sally, that musical chairs, you can modify that for listening practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Musical chairs would be great, especially if you're, I mean, I'm thinking out loud, but if you have JAWS like speaking, if you're navigating with JAWS and you say the music, instead of having the music stop, you find a chair when you hear the word heading or you hear the word link or something like that, that would be really fun, but also very crazy. But that's a really great idea. Definitely in the right headspace, Sally, for sure. Okay, cool. So before we end today, I want to talk a little bit about taking data, and you're like, oh no, here's where it gets terrible. Well, we've done all of these practice activities that are task oriented. All you have to do to take data on this is just to save student work and analyze it against the objective. So if they did a Mad Libs, or they replace the silly words or replace the words in a story with silly words, you just have to save that and say, okay, this is student work, right? That's data. And then all you have to think about is what skills need to be retaught before the final assessment, which is, of course, what we're going to do in part 4. Finally, always bring it back to the screen reader skills progression or something similar, some sort of scope and sequence to keep yourself oriented in the big picture, and use it to check off your objectives that your students have mastered. So I'm not saying you have to use the screen reader skills progression, but use something like it so that you can say, okay, this is where we've been, this is where we are, and this is where we're going, big picture, okay? Now, of course, next time we have our final component of the screen reader or of the lesson plan template or of an effective lesson, and that's the assessment activity. So that's on, do you say September 14th, Betsy?
Yes, that's our 4th and final of this series. We'll release that this same time. It's a Tuesday, 4 to 5:30 on September 14th.
Awesome, awesome. And with that, we have our final poll questions or poll question. what practice activities did we discover today? Not necessarily what will work, but what did we discover today? What were mentioned today? Check all that apply. The options are vocab story, monster maker, Mad Libs, cursor manipulatives, word search, navigation Candyland, table search, and Mad Minute. This is going to test, I think, my memory as well, especially because I made up all of these names.
And some of these are our favorite educational games
Yes.
that we didn't discuss today. And if you can
Yes.
come up with a really fun way to introduce those skills
That would be
for screen
great.
reader, I mean, let us know if you figure it out. All right. We've gotten a lot of supportive posts that I'll share with you from the chat. Absolutely love these practice activities that would be good for different grade levels of students. And what a fabulous presentation. Thank you, Cody. So great to have you in our field of work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, guys.
All right. Well, people are getting Johnny on the spot with these polls. About 54% have taken this poll. So take just another minute to look through the titles of the games, some of which we looked at today, some of which we just made up. And let us know as we wrap up today's lesson. Make sure you're marking your calendar for the 14th to join us for the fourth and final webinar. I'm going to repost some of the links that I had shared before, including the link to our handouts page, the Google Drive that Cody has been referencing, and videos for the first two webinars. All right, 55% participate in this final poll. Of the we had 8 options. The ones that rose to the top, 97% said navigation Candyland. We also got a 97% on vocab story, cursor manipulatives, Mad Libs, and table search were other popular choices. Less popular at 42% was word search, and then Monster Maker and Mad Minute only got 2 votes apiece. So Cody, we can quickly review which lessons we actually went through.
Yeah, so we talked about vocab story, we talked about Mad Libs, cursor manipulatives, navigation Candyland, and table search. The other ones we didn't cover, but I would love to hear if anybody has ideas for those as well. Cool. So but before we end, of course, I want to talk to you guys about the screen reader curriculum. If a lot of times we do these webinars and people say, but what are the actual key commands? How do I actually teach it? That's where our screen reader curriculum comes in. The student or the instructor edition is 60+ instructional videos. That's not only how to use a screen reader, but how to teach it as well. There are both student and teacher editions. So if you have a student that is ready to go and you can just give them a curriculum and they can go off and be on their own, or if you want to follow along with them, we have those options as well. We also give you done lesson plans, quizzes and tests. We have connected student data. So whenever your student takes a quiz or a test and they have that student edition, you get an email for that data. We also give you practice problems. We talked about the mock websites that are included with Navigation Candyland. All of the practice activities that we talked about are included. And of course, we have data sheets that you can fill out the data sheets and it creates charts and graphs for you so that you could bring that data to IEP meetings, team meetings, show parents, show students, all of that stuff. So that's the screen reader curriculum. And until next time, follow us on Instagram. Our handle is @ITVision. That's EYETVISION. We're going to start up Tech Tip Tuesdays in the fall. That's tech tips that are commonly trouble spots for JAWS, NVDA, Chromevox. We also have our AT for VI Professionals Facebook group. And then you can also always email us info@itvision.com. All right. Awesome. So now we're at discoveries.
All right, I'm going to jump through these real quick because I know we're running out of time because there's something else very important we need to get to at the end here today. We need your assistance. So practice activities, we've discovered they're the primary way to add fun to your screen reader lesson. Good instruction involves doing and not just explaining, and practice activities allow you to find the holes in your learner's knowledge and skill set. And that's extremely important, just to be able to figure out not just what they know, but what they don't know, because